First of all, thank you for the chance to address the congregation. I do consider it a sacred duty, and I hope the reflection will be up to the task. Like some other people in the congregation, I'm happy to hear, I'm sort of an average amateur weekend warrior, climber, mountaineer. Been doing it all my life. Like most mountaineers, one of our goals is a trip to Nepal, the rooftop of the world. 10 years ago, I was fortunate enough to be on a trip when, about 12 days into the trip, a freak early snowstorm totally socked us in. We weren't in danger. We just had nothing to do but sit around in the cook tent, chat with each other, talk with the Sherpas, play cards, and while the day away waiting for the storm to break. In other words, with an airtight excuse not to climb, it was 3 days of total bliss. One of the Sherpas had a small radio, and one afternoon he took it out, tried to get some contact with the outside world. It was kind of a scene from a bygone era. You may remember that Radio-Free Europe commercial. We all huddled around the radio as it went from static to static to signal to static. BBC reports on a cricket game, something in a language I didn't even come close to understanding, staticky Indian music, something in a language even the Sherpas didn't understand. And finally, as the Sherpa turned the dial, I heard something and yelled out, "Stop, stop." It was a female voice on the radio in English. It seemed so powerful, so sincere, so full of compassion. I had to hear what she had to say. The voice was that of Marianne Pearl. You may remember who she was. She was the wife of Danny Pearl. He was a young Wall Street reporter. The two were assigned in Karachi, Pakistan, when Danny was kidnapped by some Al-Qaeda types. After a large multinational manhunt for Danny, Marianne was sent a videotape of Danny's beheading, which was also widely distributed on the internet. Marianne was pregnant at the time. Her child, of course, would never meet his father. The interview I heard was conducted less than 10 days after all this happened, as Marianne was leaving Pakistan with her child heading for Europe. The interviewer, unforgivably, clearly wanted to get a rise out of her. I'm paraphrasing, but not much. He asked, "How hard has it been to deal with the death of your husband while carrying his child?" She replied, "Over 150 Pakistanis in Karachi were kidnapped and killed last month. So my family is by no means the only people suffering." He asked, "Are you bitter?" She replied in a voice one might use addressing a small child who is worried about thunder, monsters, or something silly. "Oh, no. I can't afford to be bitter. I have a child to raise, a life to live. I have no time for bitterness." I'll never forget the calmness and sincerity in her voice, which pierced right through that grainy transmission on the radio. At the time, I thought, whatever she's got, I'd like a dose of it. And I later found out she was a devout Buddhist. Buddhism is a religion which was started by Siddhartha Gautama about 500 years before the time of Christ. Gautama was the son of a rich king in northern India. His father loved him deeply and wanted to keep him away from all of the world's suffering. So he grew up in a loving but sterile environment. He was sheltered from poverty, sickness, old age, anything which we don't like. When he was about 12 years old, his father took him to watch a ceremonial plowing of the fields before the next planting. When he looked at the field as it was being plowed, he noticed that young grass had been torn up and that insects and their eggs had been destroyed. He felt a strange sorrow, as though his own relatives had been killed. But soon, on this nice day, a feeling of sheer joy rose up in his heart. By being taken out of himself and experiencing a moment of spontaneous compassion, the surge of selfless empathy coursed through his veins and gave him a moment of spiritual release. Most of us have had moments like these, when you have a momentary feeling of well-being, like everything is as it ought to be, or maybe that you are just a part of everything that moves. The moment often terminates when we begin to think, wow, I'm having a moment, at which time it disappears. At 29, Gautama left his home on a spiritual journey. He spent years trying to totally reject the material world, living on a small portion of rice each day. The theory being that by forcing himself out of the material world, he could force himself into the sacred world. Finally, years of doing that, he thought enough is enough and rejected the idea of going hungry all the time. He thought back to the day in his youth, how naturally he came to that spiritual moment of the plowing. He concluded that enlightenment involved a middle path. One should neither completely indulge one's physical and emotional desires, nor should he completely deprive himself and live in hunger and starvation. He also developed the concept of mindfulness, in which he scrutinized the behavior of his mind at every moment of the day. In doing so, he noticed our momentary mood swings, our quick thoughts, the constant stream of desires and irritations that plague us in, say, a 2-minute period. For example, as you sit here, you may be thinking, this is boring, or that's interesting, or I'm happy, or what's up this week, or it's hot in here, or one that's an often overriding one for me, boy, do I have to use the restroom. Gautama eventually began to form a coherent philosophy around this. Sensing he was close, he traveled to a bucolic spot where he could put it all together and reach the goal of enlightenment. In Buddhist mythology, this is referred to as the Bodhi tree. Siddhartha promised not to leave the Bodhi tree until he reached that enlightened state. And he did reach enlightenment and concluded there are 4 noble truths in the world. The first one, there is suffering, not only like hunger and those types, but there's also a sense of insecurity that plagues each and every one of us. The next 2, the cause of suffering is craving, either wanting something we don't have or attachment, seeking to hold on to something that we do. Now, often that's thought of the easy ones like cars, houses, whatever, but it goes way beyond that. For example, most of us in here think of ourselves as liberals. Nothing wrong with thinking that. But if it leads you to ignore facts or opinions that don't fit into your mindset, or worse, distracts you from your feeling as being part of the universe and the whole, the Buddha would say that's not healthy. Third, the Buddha said you can escape suffering through the extinction of self. Basically, pretty simply, you got to get over yourself. And finally, how you get over yourself is through the 8-fold path. Now, This may not seem that it's all that wise. Perhaps you have like a vision, you're in the Himalayas, you climb high on the cliff, there's the Buddha, he's meditating, and this is all you get. Yeah, you're right. Buddhism, it is not offered as a metaphysical theory. It's more of a self-help remedy to become enlightened, or at least deal with life on more realistic terms. Think of the Buddha as a very sacred self-help motivational speaker without having to pay the $350 for the videotapes afterwards. In fact, many people I know have been to a lot of these seminars, some expensive, and frequently I look at the materials they bring back. They are usually heavily laden with Buddhist philosophy. So the Buddha said, okay, we have these noble truths. How do we escape our fate? How do we escape this insecurity that we all have all the time? It's the Eightfold Path, which really could sort of be characterized as the threefold path in a way. The first is through morality, and in classic Buddhism, it's right speech, right action, and right livelihood. Now, being a lawyer, I kind of found the last one very challenging. There's nothing too original here, except the standard for morality is a little bit different than, say, the Christian standard. Buddhists approach all moral dilemmas as which path creates the least suffering? And I personally find that as a handy guideline to run my life, is when confronted with a moral dilemma, the WWJD doesn't work for me. I know it does work for some people, and I don't have a bracelet. What would Jesus do is people often have a bracelet with that. It's like Jay Leno, I got to explain the jokes. The second group, meditation, which is right effort, mindfulness, and concentration. The Buddha not only stated that we should meditate, part and parcel of a Buddhist lifestyle, but we should be mindful and careful of our thought processes. We should understand what and why we are doing something. Motive is important in Buddhism. Unlike George Costanza, you may have wondered why we did that story, we don't do things to glorify ourselves. We do them because they are the right thing to do. Finally, the last, wisdom, which is right understanding and right resolve. We should seek to see the world as it actually is, and not as we think it should be, or wish it was. When you think of what has made you over the years the most unhappy, it is usually pondering the gap between how you think things should be and how the world actually is. It doesn't mean we should not seek a better world, but it does mean we should accept things as they are. We should see things for what they are. Now, the Buddha, we're back with the Buddha under the Bodhi tree. Having reached his conclusion, sitting under the Bodhi tree, he proclaimed, "What had to be done has been accomplished. There is nothing else to do." I like that phrase, and I often use it around the house. Ever the mentor, my wife, Pam, usually corrects me, however, and helpfully points out things I haven't done, like put away the tools. This is in line with the Buddha. While he proclaimed that, he went on for the rest of his life. He preached and he taught his system until he died, probably we think in his 80s, of totally natural causes. "6 years passed after that day in the Himalayas when I heard Marianne Pearl being interviewed. In the meantime, she had become somewhat of a celebrity. She wrote a book about her experience called A Mighty Heart. The book was made into a very good movie, and she was played by Angelina Jolie. The two actually became very close friends and babysitted each other's children. She became a talking head. She participated in lecture circuits, and sure enough, she came to our hometown of Denver. Pam and I, of course, we were in the front row that night. She was a surprisingly upbeat, humorous, and charming person. She was the daughter of a wealthy patrician from Holland who had married a poor Cuban woman. Resultantly, all her European white relatives were wealthy, and her Cuban relatives were all poor. She told us that growing up, until she was a teenager, she presumed that was the natural order of things. She thought every kid had one side of the family that was rich and white, and the other side of the family that was poor and dark. After her talk, I anxiously went to the reception in order to meet her. I really wanted to tell her how I became a Buddhist after listening to her interview in the Himalayas. I was so nervous, she touched my arm to calm me down. I haven't washed it since. When I told her the story, she smiled and said with characteristic modesty, "We all do what we can," and kind of shrugged her shoulders. So, if you're not Marianne Pearl, why study Buddhism? Why go to Buddhist study groups? Why read texts on Buddhism? Why sit on your porch and meditate every morning? Why shave your head and wear saffron robes? Okay, I really don't do that. But what is the value of a Buddhist approach? Is it really worth something? And my answer is an unqualified yes. We moved to Tucson about 6 months ago from South Texas. I arrived there 4 years ago after living in Denver for years with a lengthy laundry list of things I was going to accomplish. I thought, freed of the responsibilities of making a living, raising a child, saving for retirement, putting my daughter through school, I could now reach my full potential as a human. I wanted to learn to surf. I wanted to learn to sail. I wanted to bring my yoga practice to a higher level. I wanted to do church work. I wanted to turn Texas blue, and many more. And that wasn't enough. I mean, we still spend a lot of time in Colorado, and I wanted to be the best disabled ski instructor ever. I wanted to ski more. I had many more mountains to climb. You kind of get the idea. Now, Texas turned out to be not my cup of tea on many, many, many levels. One gloomy and cold day in January a couple of years ago, I became very depressed. Lasted for days. I unloaded on Pam as to how I was underachieving in my life and how unhappy I was becoming. Pam told me, "You claim to be a Buddhist. Why don't you act like one?" So I did. I examined my thoughts and reached two conclusions. One, my list was completely unrealistic. It did not see things as they were, only as I wished them to be. Two, and way more importantly, they were too George Costanza-ish. There were some good goals on there, but my motive was way too self-aggrandizing. I needed to get back to something more modest, something less absorbed, and something more helpful to the people around me. In Marianne Pearl's words, I needed to do what I could. Now, do you need to be a Buddhist to reach these kind of conclusions? Absolutely not. The greatest living Buddhist of the day, in my opinion, the Dalai Lama, has explicitly said so. In fact, in a New York Times editorial, he suggests you might try on a different religion for size. Not even Unitarians go that far. But I do believe if you proceed with the practice of following the teachings of the Buddha and perceive the world through the Buddhist spectrum, you are more likely to get outside yourself and reach your real, true potential as a person.